They covered her skin with powder, told her dark skin was a disease, and laughed when she cried. She believed every word, until the most dangerous man in the city looked at her like she was the only light in a room full of shadows. The alarm never needed to go off. Zara Osei was always awake before it, lying still in the dark of her small room, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that the quietest part of the day was the only part that truly belonged to her. 5:13 in the morning. The city outside was not yet decided about itself. The sky hung somewhere between black and bruised purple, and the only sound was the faint hiss of a radiator that had been threatening to die for 3 winters and somehow kept refusing to. She lay there for exactly 4 minutes. She had counted them once, years ago, and the habit had calcified into a ritual. For minutes of lying in her own skin before the day required her to cover it up. Then she rose. The routine was precise, practiced, honed over years into something that looked from the outside like discipline but was really just survival wearing discipline's clothing. Long sleeves first, the soft charcoal ones, because Vivian preferred her in neutrals. Then the turtleneck was pulled up carefully over the left side of her collarbone and shoulder, where the burn scars lived. Silver-pink ridges against deep brown skin, not ugly, her mother would have said. Proof, her mother would have said, fingers gentle on the place where the fire had kissed her daughter and decided to leave a mark. But her mother had been dead for 12 years, and the women who had filled that space since had different words for different things. Then the makeup. The concealer was sitting on the edge of her dresser where it always sat, a shade and a half too light, the kind of deliberate mismatch that announced itself as an accident to anyone who didn't know better. Vivian had placed it there without explanation the month Zara turned 23, setting it down on the dresser the way you might leave out a correction, pointed, quiet, impossible to ignore. Cover it up. All of it. Zara unscrewed the cap. She knew, in the rational, clear-eyed part of her mind, that the concealer looked wrong, that it turned her deep, rich brown skin into something chalky and unresolved, like a painting abandoned halfway through. She knew it the way you know a bad habit is bad while your hands are already reaching for it, helplessly, because the groove is worn too deep. She applied it anyway. The mirror above her dresser was small, deliberately small, she had always suspected. Just large enough to check the face, not large enough to see yourself whole. She stood in front of it now, in the blue dark of early morning, and did what she always did. She looked at the result, not the person underneath. Adequate, she thought. Sufficient. She put the cap back on the concealer and turned away before anything else could happen. Her father's photograph was on the windowsill. It had always been there, Emmanuel Osei, broad-shouldered and laughing, caught mid-sentence at some long-ago family gathering, her mother's hand just visible at the edge of the frame. Zara did not look at it on hard mornings. Today, she looked at it anyway and felt the familiar, complicated ache of loving someone who had failed you so specifically and so completely that you could trace the shape of the failure like a scar. Emmanuel remarried 14 months after Abina died. He had said it was practical. He had said Zara needed a mother figure. He had said Vivian was kind, once, or perhaps he had needed to believe that so badly that the belief became its own kind of fact. He had died 4 years ago, quietly, of a heart that gave out without drama or warning. Zara had held his hand at the end. She had not said the things she might have said. She had decided, in that fluorescent hospital room, that some truths were too large and too late to speak aloud. What she had said instead was, "I know you loved me, Daddy." Whether she believed it was a question she still hadn't finished answering. The kitchen was her first performance of the day. She moved through it with the efficiency of someone who understood that competence was armor, that if you did everything correctly, there was less surface area for criticism to grip. Eggs over easy, the yolks intact, because Vivian claimed runny yolks were a sign of carelessness. Fruit arranged in a careful arc on the white plate. Cantaloupe, berries, and a few precise slices of kiwi. Coffee black, at the temperature Vivian described as not aggressively hot, which Zara had, through careful experimentation, triangulated to approximately 67 degrees Celsius. She had it ready at 6:45, as always. Vivian appeared at 6:47 in her silk robe, her silver blonde hair already smoothed into something deliberate, her eyes doing the morning scan, the rapid, practiced assessment of whether anything in her environment had failed to meet standard. They landed on Zara. "You're wearing that turtleneck again," she said. "Not a question." "It's cold," Zara said. "It's April." Vivian moved to the table, sat, and lifted her coffee with the proprietorial ease of a woman who had never questioned her right to comfort. She sipped and set it down. The temperature was acceptable. Zara could tell by the absence of reaction. "It makes you look like you're hiding something." The pause that followed was the length of a held breath. "Though I suppose you are," Vivian added pleasantly and picked up her fork. Zara turned back to the sink. Let the water run warm over her hands. This was the other routine, the one that happened inside her body, while the external one continued without interruption. The tightening in her chest that she breathed through slowly. The hot press behind her eyes that she blinked back into submission. The very deliberate mental process of deciding, again this morning, as she had decided every morning for the past several years, not to say the thing that was sitting right at the front of her teeth. "You stole my life." Those were the words. 4 of them. She had rehearsed them so many times they had worn smooth, like river stones, and she rolled them around in her mind now and then simply because they were true, and truth has a particular texture you can feel even when you can't speak it. "I need you at the Hargrove event tonight," Vivian said from behind her. "Private dinner on the 40th floor of the Meridian Tower. You'll be serving. The agency is short-staffed, apparently, and I've already confirmed you." A pause, "Dress appropriately. Hair back. And please," the particular lightness in her tone that meant the cruelest thing was arriving, "make an effort with your complexion. The Hargrove circle is refined. You understand what I mean." Zara understood exactly what she meant. "Yes," she said to the running water. "Good girl," said Vivian, and turned to her phone. "Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a dream stolen from you, or watched someone you love shrink themselves to survive? Tell me in the comments and drop the country or city you're listening from. You're not alone." What Vivian understood about Zara Osei could be written on one side of a small card and still leave room. What she did not understand, what she had worked carefully to prevent herself from knowing, was that the woman standing at her kitchen sink had once been the kind of person who stopped rooms. Not with beauty, though Zara had that too, in the deep and unapologetic way of women who carry themselves like they come from somewhere ancient and proud. She had stopped rooms with presence, with the quality of attention she brought to everything, the way she could look at a piece of fabric and see the garment it wanted to become, and the way her sketchbook had once been so full of life that flipping through it felt like falling into another world. She had been accepted to the Royal Institute of Design in London at 18 years old. Full scholarship, competitive, rare. The kind of acceptance letter that arrives in an envelope slightly heavier than normal, as if it knows what it's carrying. She had read it 4 times before she allowed herself to believe it. Then she had pressed it against her chest in her small room and cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming, almost unbearable sensation of a future arriving. The letter had lived in her desk drawer for 11 days. On the 12th day, it was gone. She had found out, years later and sideways, through a phone call she was not supposed to overhear, Vivian on the phone in the study, speaking to someone Zara didn't recognize, the words arriving in fragments through a partially open door. The Institute. Withdrawn. Her father's signature. Laughter, brief and satisfied. Zara had stood in the hallway outside the study door for a long time after the call ended. Then she had gone back to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and something in her, some essential, load-bearing part of her, had quietly, permanently shifted. That had been the first fire. The second one, the kitchen fire, the one that left the scars, had come 3 months later. An accident, truly, this time. A cooking fire that moved faster than it should have, and Zara reaching into it before she thought clearly enough not to. The scars were the least of what that night cost her. By then, she had already learned to be small. The fire simply made the lesson visible. She took the subway to the Meridian Tower that evening, uniform in a bag, face powdered into apology. The city ran alongside her through the train windows, lit and indifferent and enormous, full of people living at full volume while Zara sat with her hands in her lap, taking up as little space as possible. Across the aisle, a small girl, 5, maybe 6, was watching her with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that looking was rude. She had dark skin, this child, deep and luminous and beautiful, her hair in 2 pom-pom puffs with yellow ribbons, her eyes large and satisfied with the world. She looked at Zara and smiled, the enormous, gummy, full-commitment smile of a person who has not yet been taught to portion out their warmth. Zara felt something move through her chest like a warm current. She smiled back, a real one, small and private and slightly devastating in the way real smiles are when they arrive unexpectedly. The girl waved. Zara waved back. Then the train reached her stop and she stood, and the doors opened, and she walked out into the evening air and back into the performance. The service entrance of the Meridian Tower was around the back, which was the point. The kitchen was already running at full heat when she arrived, controlled chaos, the particular symphony of a high-end catering operation in its final hour before service. She changed quickly, pinned her hair into invisibility, and presented herself to the floor supervisor, a thin man with a clipboard who looked at her face briefly and moved on without comment. She was scanning the layout, getting her bearings, when a hand touched her arm gently. "Baby," she turned. The woman was broad and warm, somewhere in her 60s, with the kind of face that had decided long ago to be completely honest about everything it felt. Jamaican accent, kind eyes above a catering uniform. Her name tag said Gloria. "Who did that to your face?" Gloria said, frowning, studying Zara's concealer with the open concern of someone who had seen this before. It's just makeup," Zara said. "That's not makeup, sweetheart. That's a mask." Gloria reached into her apron pocket, produced a small cloth, and before Zara could form a protest, pressed it gently to her cheek. The concealer came away in a streak. Zara went still. Gloria looked at what was beneath, the real skin, the deep, true brown of it, and her expression moved through something complicated before settling into a quiet, firm tenderness. "There she is," Gloria said softly. "Lord, you are beautiful." The word hit Zara somewhere undefended. She blinked once. The kind of blink that is doing a great deal of structural work. "Thank you," she managed. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "Don't cover yourself up tonight," Gloria said. "Not in here." Zara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I have to," and picked up her tray and walked toward the hall. But she didn't reapply the concealer. The Hargrove event was the kind of gathering that announced its own importance through restraint, no excess, no noise, just the particular confidence of people who had never needed to try. 40 floors up. The city spread out beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows like a gift it had given itself. The guests moved and murmured and clinked glasses with the ease of people for whom this was simply Tuesday. Zara moved between them like water around stone. Don't be seen, be efficient, disappear. She was good at this. She had had years of practice. She was crossing the main hall with a fresh tray of champagne flutes, eyes forward, pace measured, when the elevator at the far end of the room opened. She felt it before she saw it. The shift in the room's atmosphere was subtle but real, a recalibration, like the way a compass needle swings when something magnetic enters its field. Conversations didn't stop, but they adjusted. Postures changed. A few heads turned with the practiced casualness of people pretending they weren't looking. Zara kept her eyes on her tray. She heard the footsteps, unhurried, evenly spaced, the walk of a man who had never once in his life needed to signal his own arrival, because the room always did it for him. She looked up. He stood at the entrance to the hall. Dark suit, precisely cut, the kind of black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Korean, she estimated early 30s, with the bone structure of someone carved from something harder than ordinary material. Jaw set, eyes moving across the room in a slow, methodical sweep that was not admiration and was not anxiety, but was something colder and more thorough than either. Two men flanked him at a half-step's distance. They were not assistants. The room knew who he was. She could tell from the particular quality of the not looking, the way powerful people pretend not to notice power. She didn't know who he was. She looked back at her tray, adjusted her grip on the stem of the nearest flute, began to turn toward the far side of the room. She did not see, could not have seen, the way his eyes, still completing their methodical survey of the space, moved across the room and reached her and stopped. Not long, a breath, maybe two. The pause of a man who did not pause. Then his eyes moved on, and the moment closed over itself like water, and Zara walked toward the far wall with her tray of champagne, and the evening continued. But something somewhere had already begun. It happened because of a champagne flute. Not the collision that had already begun invisibly in the breath-long pause by the elevator, but the moment that changed everything, the one that would live in Zara's chest for weeks afterward like a coal that refused to cool, that happened because of a champagne flute, and a man named Bryce Hargrove, and the particular cruelty of people who have never once been made to answer for their words. Zara was refilling glasses on the eastern side of the hall when she felt it, the shift in temperature that precedes humiliation, the way a drop in barometric pressure precedes a storm. She had developed a sensitivity to it over the years, a kind of early warning system built from experience, from all the times she hadn't seen it coming and wished she had. She felt it now, but she was already in the middle of the room, tray in hand, and there was nowhere to quietly disappear to. Bryce Hargrove was the kind of man who had been told he was charming so many times and by so many people that the information had calcified into belief. He was 60, red-faced and robust, with the loud, backslapping ease of someone who had inherited enough wealth that consequence had always been someone else's problem. He was standing with a small cluster of guests near the window, two other men in expensive suits and a woman whose smile had the brittle quality of someone performing enjoyment, when Zara approached to refill the nearest glass. She kept her eyes down. She reached for the glass. Well, Bryce said loudly enough that the word carried, "Look at that." Zara's hand stilled on the stem of the flute. She did not look up. Her chest had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a body bracing. Vivian actually sent us the authentic experience tonight. He laughed, a broad, self-satisfied sound. The two men with him produced the kind of social laughter that means I'm not sure this is funny, but I don't want to be the one who isn't laughing. What do they call it, straight from the motherland? He tilted his head, studying Zara with the open, assessing look of someone examining an object. Though someone's made a bit of a mess of the face, haven't they? What is that powder? Sweetheart, that's not your color. The woman with the brittle smile laughed too, then. That was the one that landed. Zara stood with the champagne bottle in her hand and the tray balanced against her arm and felt the room tilt slightly. Not physically, but internally, the way it does when humiliation is thorough enough to affect your sense of gravity. She was aware, distantly, of other guests who had heard, of heads that had turned, of the particular social paralysis that descends on rooms when someone is being publicly degraded and no one wants the responsibility of being the person who stops it. She set her jaw. Don't say anything. Don't react. Finish the pour and move on. The coaching was automatic. Years of Vivian had made it automatic. She reached for the glass again. Though I suppose it doesn't matter much, Bryce continued, warming to himself now, the way men like him do when nothing stops them. Dark as she is, the powder doesn't really. Hargrove. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. Zara looked up. He was standing 8 feet away, Seo Jean Kwan, the man from the elevator, with a glass of whiskey in one hand and his eyes fixed on Bryce Hargrove with an expression that was not anger. Exactly, because anger implies some loss of control, and there was nothing uncontrolled about this man. It was something more precise than anger. Something colder. Assessment, she thought, watching his face. He is deciding something. Bryce turned, and the confidence on his face underwent a rapid, involuntary adjustment. "Kwan," he said, with the careful heartiness of a man recalibrating. "Didn't see you over there, didn't mean to." "What did you mean?" Jean said. His English was precise, unaccented in the particular way of someone who had learned the language as a tool and mastered it so completely that fluency had become its own form of control. He moved his gaze from Bryce to Zara, one brief, direct beat, and then back to Bryce with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. Bryce laughed, slightly too loud, slightly too late. Just having a bit of fun. You know how it is. I don't, Jean said. Explain it to me. The silence stretched. The two men in expensive suits had stopped laughing. The woman with the brittle smile had found something very interesting to look at on the far side of the room. Bryce opened his mouth and closed it, and the confidence he'd walked in with seemed to be undergoing some kind of emergency restructuring. It was just a comment, he said, quieter now. About her skin, Jean said. Not a question, a clarification. The kind that doubles as an indictment. Bryce said nothing. Jean let the silence run for 3 full seconds. Zara counted them, helplessly, her champagne bottle still in her hand. And then he said, in the same level tone he might use to discuss weather or logistics, "If you speak to anyone on this floor like that again, we will not be doing business. I want you to be clear on that." He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. Bryce Hargrove nodded, one short, chastened dip of his large head, and turned back to the window, and his cluster of guests quietly redistributed themselves, and the room exhaled and rearranged itself around the moment as if it had never happened. As if it had never happened. Except that Zara was still standing there with a champagne bottle in her hand, and her heart was doing something she couldn't immediately name. And Jean Quan had already turned away and was walking toward the far side of the room, and she was watching his back and feeling as though the floor had subtly and permanently shifted beneath her feet. She found the corridor by instinct, a service hallway off the main hall, narrow and quiet and blessedly empty, where the noise of the party became a muffled hum through the wall. She stood there with her back against the cool plaster and allowed herself, for exactly 60 seconds, to feel it. The hot pressure behind her eyes. The trembling in her hands that she'd suppressed through the entire encounter. The complicated, layered thing in her chest that was part humiliation and part something else, something she couldn't afford to look at directly yet. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed. You're fine, you've had worse. You've had so much worse. She knew she had. Vivian alone had offered her a master class in the particular art of being diminished by someone who smiles while doing it. This was not the worst thing that had ever been said to her or about her. It was not the worst thing. And yet something about it, the public nature of it, the laughter, the powder comment that had reached inside and found something still raw, something about it tonight had gotten through in a way she hadn't been prepared for. She was still standing there, hand to her mouth, when she heard the footsteps. Not the clipped efficiency of the catering staff. Slower, more deliberate. She straightened immediately, pulled her hand down, squared her shoulders, and rearranged her face into something serviceable. Jean Quan stepped into the corridor. He stopped when he saw her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of a man surprised, but in the way of a man who had expected to find something and is now recalibrating his approach. They looked at each other across the narrow hallway. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room. And closer, the coldness she'd observed from a distance had a different quality, not absence of feeling, she thought, but feeling held under enormous pressure, like something compressed rather than something missing. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. Then, "Are you all right?" 3 words spoken quietly, without the performance of concern, no widened eyes, no practiced sympathy, just the question, direct, like he actually wanted the answer. Zara blinked. "Yes," she said automatically. He looked at her the way people rarely looked at her, without assessment, without the rapid categorization she was accustomed to. Just looking, as if the answer she gave mattered, and he was willing to wait for a real one. It was, she realized, deeply unsettling. "You don't have to say yes," he said. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at a point slightly past his shoulder, and said, with the careful precision of someone choosing every word, "I've heard worse. I know how to handle it. That's not what I asked." She looked back at him then, directly, because something in his tone had made the automatic deflection feel suddenly inadequate. His eyes were dark and steady and giving nothing away, and she had the strange, disorienting sensation of being looked at by someone who was not waiting for her to perform anything. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that means something, even before you've decided what. "Why did you do that?" she asked. The question came out before she'd authorized it. Something moved across his face, brief. "Do what?" "Step in." She held his gaze because she had started this and she was going to finish it. "You didn't have to. Men like Hargrove say things like that all the time at events like this, and no one." Stopped and recalibrated. "No one usually says anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." 2 words, and the weight in them, the acknowledgement packed into "I know," the fact that he didn't explain or justify or offer himself a compliment for what he'd done, landed in her chest with a soft, devastating precision. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor hummed with the distant sounds of the party on the other side of the wall, glass and laughter, and the performance of ease. And in here there was just the 2 of them, and the particular charged stillness of a moment that knows what it is even when the people inside it don't. "I should get back," Zara said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move from the doorway. Then, after a beat, "What's your name?" She almost didn't tell him. She could feel the instinct, the old, practiced self-protection, rising up, counseling caution, reminding her of all the reasons that men like this, in worlds like this, did not ask questions like that for reasons that ended well for women like her. "Zara," she said anyway. Something happened on his face. So brief she might have imagined it, a fractional softening around the eyes, there and gone. "Co Jean," he said. She nodded once and turned. Walked back toward the main hall with the champagne bottle still in her hand. Her steps measured and even, and she did not look back. She did not let herself look back. Behind her, Co Jean Kwan stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was necessary for a man who had somewhere to be and people waiting. He turned the name over once, in the quiet of his own mind, Zara. Then he straightened his jacket, walked back into the room, and picked up the thread of an evening that no longer held quite the same texture it had before. His second-in-command, Dae-young, compact and watchful and 12 years his shadow, materialized at his elbow within 60 seconds, as he always did. "The Hargrove situation?" Dae murmured. "Handled," Co Jean said. Dae nodded, said nothing. But his eyes moved, briefly and precisely, to the doorway Co Jean had just come through, and back to his employer's face, and then away again. He filed the observation without comment, the way he filed everything. And across the room, Zara Osei set down the champagne bottle, picked up a fresh tray, and walked back into the performance of invisibility. But she had not reapplied the concealer. Her real skin was showing, and somewhere in the room, without looking, she was aware of exactly where he was. She scrubbed her face that night like she was trying to remove something deeper than makeup. The bathroom was small, one of those narrow, afterthought bathrooms that exist in apartments designed by people who considered bathing a practical necessity rather than a human right. A single overhead bulb that flickered slightly when the heat came on. A mirror with a water stain at the bottom left corner that Zara had stopped seeing years ago, the way you stop seeing familiar damage. She stood at the sink at 11:47 at night and worked the makeup remover into her skin in slow, methodical circles, and tried very hard not to think about the corridor. She thought about the corridor. The problem, and she was already calling it a problem, which told her something, was not the intervention itself. She had witnessed powerful people silence other powerful people before. It happened. It was rarely about the person at the center of it. It was about territory, about the particular way men like Co Jean Kwan maintained social dominance, by demonstrating clearly and publicly that the rules in any given room were his rules. Defending her had likely been incidental. A point to be made. Hargrove had simply provided the occasion. This was rational. This was sensible. This was the careful, self-protective logic she had built over years of learning that hope was expensive, and she was not, currently, in a financial position to afford it. She rinsed. looked at the mirror. Her real face looked back. Deep brown skin, properly visible now. The concealer fully gone, the face beneath it unguarded in the harsh overhead light. The high cheekbones. The full mouth, slightly compressed from the habit of keeping things in. Her natural hair, released from its pins, was pushing back against the constraints of the evening with the quiet insistence of something that had been suppressed and was done cooperating. She looked at herself for a long time. She could not remember the last time she had done that. Simply stood and looked, without immediately moving to correct or cover or adjust. "Your skin is beautiful, sweetheart." Gloria's voice arrived without invitation, warm and direct, the way truths sometimes ambush you when your defenses are down. "There she is." Zara pressed her fingertips against the edge of the sink. "Stop it," she said quietly, to her own reflection. "Stop." The reflection did not look particularly convinced. She thought about his eyes. That was the real problem, she admitted to herself at 12:15, lying on her bed in the dark with her arm across her face, as if she could physically block the memory. Not the intervention, she'd already dismantled that into something manageable. The eyes. He had looked at her in that corridor with the particular, devastating quality of someone who was not deciding what category to place her in. Most people, she had found, began looking at her by doing exactly that, running their rapid internal calculation, filing her under whatever heading their particular set of biases had prepared. The results varied. The process was always the same. He had not done that. He had simply looked, as though she were a complete and specific person whose existence required no further explanation or justification. "You don't have to say yes." She turned onto her side. Outside her window, the city continued its relentless, indifferent project of being alive at all hours. A car horn somewhere below. The distant siren of something urgent happening to someone she would never know. The radiator ticking in the corner like a clock that had lost track of what it was supposed to be measuring. She thought about the way he'd said her name. Not Zara as a transaction. Not the way her name was usually spoken, with the slight unconscious emphasis that meant noted and filed. He had said it like it was information he intended to keep. Like it mattered that he had it correctly. She sat up in the dark. "He is a stranger," she said, to the room, at a volume meant for herself alone. "He is a powerful, dangerous stranger who said 6 sentences to you in a corridor and will never think of you again. You are the help. You were the subject of a social correction that was never actually about you. And you are lying here at midnight constructing meaning out of nothing because you are tired and your defenses were down and Bryce Hargrove's words got through further than they should have. And that is all this is." She lay back down, stared at the ceiling. "And you didn't look back," said the part of her that was not interested in being managed. "The whole walk across the room, you didn't look back once. And you knew exactly where he was anyway." She closed her eyes. Sleep did not come quickly. Across the city, in a penthouse that occupied the entirety of the 53rd floor of a building that did not appear in any public real estate listing, Seo Jin Kwan was still awake. This was not unusual. He slept poorly as a rule, for sometimes 5 hours, taken in 2 separate intervals like a man who did not fully trust unconsciousness. He was at his desk now, jacket gone, the top button of his shirt open, with a glass of water he hadn't touched and 3 open files in front of him that he had been reading for the past 40 minutes without absorbing a single word. He closed the top file, opened it again. Read the same paragraph for the 4th time. Dae-young had gone home at 10, with the pointed punctuality of a man who believed his employer worked too late and expressed this belief through the passive communication of departing at reasonable hours. Before he left, he had set a fresh glass of water on the desk, replacing the one Seo Jin had also not touched, and said, with the neutral tone of a man reporting weather, "The woman from the Hargrove event." Seo Jin had looked up. "Her name is Zara Osei," Day said. 26. She works through a catering agency, intermittently. Before that, various service positions. Father deceased. Lives with her stepmother in Chongro district. A pause. "That's everything public," Seo Jin had said. I didn't ask you to pull that. Day had said, no, and left. Now Co. Jean sat with the information, and the file he wasn't reading and the water he wasn't drinking, and did what he almost never did. He sat with something he could not immediately categorize. He was a man who processed the world through utility. People were variables, their value determined by their function, their risk level assessed and managed, their positions on the board understood. This was not cruelty. It was clarity. He had learned early that sentiment was a vulnerability that cost more than it returned, and he had structured his life accordingly. Cleanly, efficiently, without the mess of needs he couldn't control. The woman in the corridor had been a variable he hadn't anticipated. Not her presence. Service staff were background data at events like this, processed and dismissed. But the moment she had looked at him, directly, without the performance of deference or the calculation of advantage that he usually read in the eyes of people who knew who he was, he had felt something that he could only describe, imprecisely and with some irritation, as interruption. As if something in him that ran quietly and continuously had, for a moment, stopped. He picked up his water glass. Set it down. Why did you do that? She had asked, and he had said I know, which was not an answer and was also entirely an answer, the only honest one he had. He pulled open his laptop, typed 2 words into the search field, stared at them, closed the laptop without pressing enter. He stood, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked out at the city the way he always looked at it, as a system. A network of moving parts and pressures and outcomes that could be read, if you knew how to read it. He was very good at reading things. He could not, at this particular moment, read what had happened to him in a service corridor at the Meridian Tower. And that, more than anything else about the evening, was what was keeping him awake. Here's something I want you to sit with. Have you ever talked yourself out of something real because you were afraid to hope? Tell me in the comments. Because what Zara is doing right now, I think a lot of us know exactly how that feels. 3 days passed. Zara worked. She took 2 more catering shifts, different venues, smaller events, and moved through them with her usual practiced efficiency, and did not think about the Hargrove event more than 7 or 8 times per shift, which she considered a reasonable ratio. She helped Vivian prepare for a luncheon. She cooked. She cleaned. She wore the concealer and the long sleeves and the turtlenecks, and each morning she looked at the mirror for the 4 minutes she allowed herself. And each morning the face in the mirror looked slightly more like it was waiting for something she hadn't decided to give it yet. On the 4th day, she got a call from the catering agency telling her that a client had specifically requested her for a private event. Which client? She asked. The woman on the phone gave her the name of a company, SJK Holdings, and an address in the financial district, and a date 2 days out. Zara sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended. SJK Holdings. She was not naive. She was not, despite everything Vivian had spent years trying to make her, a fool. She knew exactly what those initials stood for. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time in the kitchen, with the afternoon light coming through the window and landing on her arm in a warm stripe, and she had a conversation with herself that was honest in the way she rarely allowed herself to be honest. He had sought her out. She did not know why. She had a list of possible reasons, and most of them were the sensible, self-protective kind. The kind that concluded with her declining politely and returning to the ordered smallness of her current life. The list was logical. The list was responsible. The list was exactly the kind of thing a woman who had learned that hope was expensive and the world did not mean her well should absolutely follow. She set the phone on the counter. Thought about a little girl on a subway with yellow ribbons in her hair, smiling with her whole face, unguarded and luminous and completely unashamed. Thought about a mirror she'd stood in front of for longer than 4 minutes, for the first time in years. Thought about you don't have to say yes. She picked the phone back up. Called the agency. Tell them I'll be there, she said. She told herself, as she hung up, that it was purely practical. The rate was better than standard, significantly better, and she needed the money, and that was the beginning and end of it. She told herself this with the calm, clear authority of a woman who had made a rational decision based on financial reality. She almost believed it. Almost. That evening, alone in her room with the door closed, she opened the drawer of her bedside table, the one she hadn't opened in over a year, and took out the sketchbook. It was a large one, spiral-bound, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges from disuse. The last entry was dated 14 months ago, an unfinished sketch of a dress that she had started and then stopped mid-line, the pencil mark trailing off at the hip like a sentence abandoned. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at it. Then slowly she turned to a fresh page. She didn't know what she was going to draw. She picked up the pencil anyway and let her hand move the way it used to, without interrogation, without the inner committee that now governed most of what she did. What emerged gradually in light, careful lines was a figure, a woman standing, shoulders back, head level, wearing nothing elaborate, just a dress floor length, with a neckline that didn't apologize for the collarbone it revealed. The scars along the shoulder were drawn in two, not hidden, not emphasized. Just there, the way they were, part of the composition rather than an interruption of it. She looked at what she'd drawn for a long time. Then she closed the sketchbook, put it on the nightstand instead of back in the drawer, and lay down in the dark, and this time, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. She did not spend the last hour before sleep dismantling the careful structure of a thing she was trying very hard not to feel. She just let it be there, small and fragile and not yet named. But there. The address the agency had given her led to a building that didn't look like it needed anything from anyone. It rose 47 floors above the financial district in dark glass and clean architectural lines. The kind of structure that communicated its own importance through restraint, through the deliberate absence of anything unnecessary. No flashy signage, no ornamental excess, just the quiet, absolute confidence of something that had been built by people who understood that true power never announces itself. Zara stood on the pavement outside it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She had dressed carefully this morning, more carefully than the occasion technically demanded, which she had noted and chosen not to examine too closely. The long sleeves were there, as always. The turtleneck. But she had done something different with her hair, left it out, her natural coils pulled back loosely rather than pinned into erasure, so that the shape of it was visible, present hers. She had stood in front of the small mirror for 6 minutes this morning instead of 4. She had not applied the concealer. She didn't know exactly when that decision had been made. Somewhere between waking and standing at the dresser, the cap had simply stayed on. She had looked at the tube for a long moment, and then she had put it in the drawer, and she had finished getting ready, and she had not thought about it again until this moment, standing outside a building that cost more per floor than she would earn in a lifetime, feeling the morning air on her actual face. She picked up her bag, walked to the entrance. The lobby was all dark marble and recessed lighting, and the particular hush of a space that had been designed to signal that noise happened elsewhere. A security desk ran the width of the back wall. 2 guards, both watching her approach with the alert neutrality of professionals. "Zara Osei," she said when she reached them. "I'm with the catering agency. I was told to report to Miss Osei." She turned. Dae-young was standing to her left. She hadn't heard him approach, which she suspected was a skill rather than an accident. He was compact and dark-suited, with a face that communicated information efficiently and volunteered nothing. She recognized him from the Hargrove event, one of the 2 men who had flanked CO Jean at the elevator. "I'll take you up," he said. It was not a question. It was also not unfriendly. It was simply the statement of a man for whom most things had already been decided. She followed him to the elevator. They rode to the 43rd floor in silence that Day appeared to find perfectly comfortable. Zara used the time to recalibrate, to remind herself systematically of the version of this situation that made sense. A private client, a high-end function requiring specialized staff. The premium rate was explained by the premium environment. This was work. She was here to work. The elevator opened onto a private corridor, wide, quiet, floored in the same dark marble as the lobby, with tall windows on one side that gave the city back to you from 43 floors up in a way that made it look, briefly, manageable. Day led her left, toward a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. "Mr. Kwan is expecting you," he said, and knocked twice. Zara had half a second to absorb the name. Mr. Kwan, not the agency, not a function, him specifically, before the doors opened. Seo Jin was standing at the window. He turned when the door opened, unhurriedly, with the particular economy of movement she was already beginning to recognize as characteristic, and looked at her across the length of a room that was large and spare and organized with the same deliberate restraint as the building itself. A desk, a long conference table, bookshelves that held actual books, arranged without apparent aesthetic agenda, like someone had simply put them where they were needed. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, the city spread out below in the early morning light. He was in a dark shirt today, sleeves rolled to the forearm, no jacket. Less armored than the Hargrove event. She noticed this and filed it, and tried not to assign it meaning. His eyes moved to her face, briefly, taking in the absence of the concealer, and then to her eyes. His expression did not change, but something in it settled, as though a question he hadn't voiced had just been answered. "Miss Osei," he said. "Mr. Kwan," she said. A beat. "You know this wasn't a catering request," she said. She hadn't planned to open with that. But the room was very quiet, and he was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that seemed to make her usual management systems less effective, and the sentence had arrived before she'd approved it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The outline of one, suggested rather than completed. "No," he said. "It wasn't. Then what is it?" He moved from the window to the desk, not toward her, just repositioning, giving the conversation a slightly different geometry. He picked up a folder from the desk's surface and set it down again without opening it. "I have a position," he said. "Household manager for my personal residence. The role requires someone organized, discreet, and capable of managing a complex domestic environment without supervision." He paused. "The compensation is significant. I had my team identify candidates." Zara looked at him steadily. "And the catering agency produced my name. I asked for it specifically," he said, and the directness of it, no deflection, no pretense, landed with the same quiet force as everything else about him. She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Because you're capable. And because," another pause, shorter this time, "I suspect you are significantly underemployed relative to your actual ability." The sentence was professional. It was also, she thought, not entirely professional. She looked at the folder on the desk. "What does the role involve?" she said. He walked her through it with the efficient thoroughness of a man who had prepared, which she filed as interesting. Household management for his private residence, a separate property, a townhouse in the quieter northern district. Staff coordination, event management for private functions, liaison with his personal security team. The hours were defined. The expectations were specific. The salary figure he named made her blink once before she controlled her face. "That's," she began. "Standard for the role," he said. It was not standard for any role she had ever held or heard of. She knew this, and she suspected he knew this, and she chose, for the moment, to let it pass. "I'd need to give the agency notice," she said. "That's handled." She looked at him sharply. "I haven't said yes." Something shifted in his expression, the outline of that not-quite smile again, and beneath it something that might have been respect. "No," he said. "You haven't." The room was very quiet. Outside the windows, the city moved in its perpetual, indifferent motion. Tiny cars, tiny people, the enormous ordinary machinery of a world that did not particularly care what happened in this room. Zara thought about the catering agency, about Vivian's apartment and the wrong-toned concealer on the dresser and the 4-minute mornings and the sketchbook in the drawer that had spent 14 months accumulating silence. She thought about a corridor, and you don't have to say yes, and a name said like it was information worth keeping. "I have conditions," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Waiting. I work the role as defined. Nothing outside the scope of what you've described. My personal life is not part of the arrangement. She held his gaze. And I need accommodation. I can't remain at my current address and manage a property in the Northern District efficiently. This was practically true, and it was also, she acknowledged to herself, the most honest reason she'd given for anything in a long time. She needed to leave Vivian's apartment. She had needed to leave for years. Co. Jean was quiet for a moment. There's a staff apartment attached to the townhouse, he said. Private entrance. It would be part of the package. She nodded once. Those conditions are acceptable, he said. Do you have others? Yes, she said. One more. He waited. I don't cover my face at work, she said. Quietly, but without room for negotiation. I don't wear anything I'm told to wear to look a particular way. How I present myself is not part of the role. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. In those 3 seconds, she was aware of her own heartbeat, steady but present, and of the quality of his attention, and of the fact that she had just said something that had taken 26 years to say out loud in precisely that way. Of course, he said, as if it were obvious, as if it had never been a question. She breathed. Then yes, she said. I'll take the role. She moved out of Vivian's apartment 4 days later. There was not, in the end, very much to move. This was a fact that might have been sad, if she let it be, the physical evidence of a life deliberately kept small, because small things are harder to take away, and she had learned that lesson early and learned it thoroughly. 3 boxes. A suitcase. The sketchbook, placed on top of the first box with some ceremony. Vivian had been in the living room when Zara came to tell her. She had looked up from her phone with the expression of someone who has already prepared several responses to a conversation they anticipated. You're making a mistake, Vivian said. Probably, Zara said. I've made them before. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Who is he? A client, Zara said. Don't be naive. Men like that don't. I'll have my father's things forwarded once I have a permanent address, Zara said, and picked up her first box and walked to the door. Zara. Vivian's voice had shifted. The first time in Zara's memory that it had carried something other than control. Something that was almost human. You don't know what you're walking into. Zara stopped at the door. She stood there for a moment with the box in her arms and the door open and the hallway beyond it, and she felt, for the last time, she decided, the old gravity of the place. The pull of it. The way 12 years of smallness could make the known cage feel safer than the unknown open. She felt it. She stepped through the door anyway. Goodbye, Vivian, she said, and meant it completely. The townhouse was in a tree-lined street in the Northern District. Old stone and high ceilings, the kind of building that had been standing long enough to have opinions about itself. The staff apartment was on the ground floor, private entrance from the side garden, with windows that let in the afternoon light in long, generous rectangles. It was small. It was nothing like the rooms she'd seen on the upper floors of Co. Jin's properties. It was entirely, completely hers. She set the sketchbook on the windowsill of the main room, not in a drawer, not in a box. On the sill, in the light, where it could be seen. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Breathed. Then she opened the first box and began to make herself at home. 3 hours later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it. Co. Jean was standing in the side garden, in a dark coat, with 2 paper cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had decided to do something and was now experiencing the first moment of uncertainty about whether it was a good idea. It was the first genuinely uncertain expression she had seen on his face. She found it unexpectedly devastating. The kitchen isn't stocked yet, he said, by way of explanation. I thought, he stopped. Offered the coffee. She looked at the cups. Looked at him. How do you take it? She asked. Black, he said. She took one of the cups. He took the other. They stood in the side garden of the townhouse in the afternoon light, with the trees moving quietly overhead and the city doing its distant, irrelevant thing beyond the walls, and drank their coffee in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the first real silence they had shared, not the charged silence of the corridor, not the professional silence of the office. Something easier than either. Something that didn't need to be anything other than what it was. She looked at him sideways once. He was looking at the garden with the expression of a man remembering how to be somewhere without a reason. She looked back at the trees. Neither of them spoke for a while. Neither of them needed to. The townhouse had a rhythm to it. Zara discovered this in the first week. Not because anyone told her, but because she paid attention, which was something she had always done, a survival skill that had quietly repackaged itself into professional competence over the years. She paid attention to the way the morning light moved through the upper floors, to the timing of the security rotation, to which rooms Jean used and which ones he walked past without entering, the way you walk past a door you've decided not to open. There was one room on the second floor, at the end of the eastern corridor, across from the study, that he never entered. She noted it, said nothing. Her days settled into a structure that felt, cautiously and incrementally, like something she hadn't had in a very long time. She rose early. The habit was too deep to break, though the reason for it had changed. Before, she woke early because the pre-dawn quiet was the only space that belonged to her. Now she woke early because there was work she actually wanted to do, the particular, satisfying work of organizing a complex environment and watching it respond. She coordinated with the townhouse staff. A housekeeper named Mrs. Beck, who was 60 and Korean and initially skeptical, and a groundskeeper named Tobias, who was 22 and easy and called her boss from the first day, which made something warm and surprised move through her chest each time. She took her meals in the staff kitchen mostly. Occasionally in the main kitchen, when the house was quiet and she was working late. Jean was there more than she'd expected. Not intrusively. He moved through the townhouse with the same contained, deliberate quality he moved through every space, and he did not treat her presence as an invitation to conversation. But he was there, working at the kitchen island with his laptop and his black coffee at 7 in the morning when she came to coordinate with Mrs. Beck. In the study until late at night, the light visible under the door when she passed in the corridor. They developed a language without discussing it, a set of acknowledgments and silences and small practical exchanges that accumulated, gradually, into something that felt like familiarity. She left his coffee ready at 7 without being asked. He never commented on it. She had been at the townhouse for 9 days when the sleeve incident happened. It was a Wednesday, early evening. The household staff had gone home. Jean was expected back from a meeting in an hour, and Zara was in the main kitchen working through the logistics for a private dinner he was hosting at the end of the week. She had paperwork spread across the kitchen island, menus, supplier contacts, a timeline broken into 30-minute segments, and she was working through it with the focused efficiency that was, she had started to realize, one of the things she genuinely loved about herself. The competence. The way her mind organized complexity into something navigable. She was reaching for a folder on the far side of the island when her sleeve caught on the edge of a stool and pulled back. Not dramatically, just back, for inches, maybe 5, exposing the lower edge of the burned scars on her left forearm. The silver pink of them catching the kitchen light. She registered it, reached to pull the sleeve down. Stopped. Jean was standing in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He moved quietly, always, and he was still in his coat, which meant he'd come directly here before going upstairs. He was looking at the papers on the island, not at her, and then his gaze traveled to her arm and stayed there. 1 second. 2. Zara's hand was still hovering at the edge of the sleeve. She watched his face. She had catalogued, over her lifetime, every response to the scars. The flinch, quick, involuntary, the body's honest reaction before the social training kicked in. The pity, the softening of the eyes, the careful voice modulation, the delicate performance of not making it a big deal in a way that made it enormous. The discomfort, the deliberate looking away, the subject change, the physical repositioning that put more distance between them. The morbid curiosity, rarer but present, the eyes that wanted to look and kept coming back. She had documents for all of these. She knew exactly what to do with each one. Seo Jin's face did none of them. He looked at her arm with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Direct, unperforming, taking in information without editorializing it. And then he looked up at her face, and what was in his eyes was not pity or discomfort or curiosity. It was simply recognition, as if he understood something without needing it explained. He said nothing. He walked to the kitchen island, set his keys down, looked at the dinner party timeline she'd been working on. "You've built in 90 minutes between the third course and dessert," he said. Zara looked at him, pulled her sleeve down slowly, with deliberate calm. "For conversation," she said. "The guests you've listed, they'll want time at the table. If you move straight to dessert, it reads as a rush." He studied the timeline. "Change the main course to 50 minutes. Add 30 to that window." "Done," she said. She made the note. He poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and looked at the rest of the paperwork with the focused engagement of a man who had arrived at a conclusion about something and moved on. He had not mentioned the scars. He had not mentioned them in the careful, weighted way that made the absence louder than speech. He had simply continued, as if her arm were as unremarkable as the rest of her, as if she were just complete, as she was. Zara kept her eyes on the timeline. Her handwriting, in the margin where she'd made the note, was very slightly less steady than usual. She did not think he noticed. She thought he probably noticed. She found the photograph 12 days into her time at the townhouse. She was not snooping. This was important to her. She had principles about the boundaries of her role, and invading her employer's private space was not something she would do. She was conducting a household inventory, a practical task, a legitimate one, working through the upper floor rooms with a clipboard and the methodical attention she brought to everything. The eastern corridor, the rooms she'd already catalogued, and then the door at the end, the one he never opened. She stood in front of it for a moment. The inventory required her to account for all rooms. She knocked, though she knew the house was empty. Then she opened the door. It was a sitting room, or had been once. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the curtains drawn, the air carrying the particular stillness of a space that had been sealed against time. Dust moved in the thin line of light from the door. A bookshelf, a small table, a wingback chair under its sheet, positioned near the window as if whoever sat in it had liked to look out. And on the wall above the bookshelf, uncovered, unshielded, the only thing in the room that hadn't been put away, a photograph. Framed, black and white. A woman, perhaps 50, Korean, seated in what looked like a garden. She had a quality of composed stillness that was immediately recognizable. The same bone structure, the same quality of contained attention, the same particular angle of the jaw. Beside her, younger, perhaps 16, in a school uniform that he wore with the self-conscious straightness of a boy still growing into himself, was Seo Jin. He was looking at the camera with an expression that was entirely foreign to the man Zara knew. Unguarded, young. There was something in his eyes in this photograph that she had not yet seen in the real ones. Something open, unarmored, that had not yet learned to be anything other than itself. His mother's hand was on his shoulder. Zara stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph for a long time. She was in the study that evening, returning signed supplier contracts to the desk, when she heard him in the corridor. She called out, so he would know she was there, and he appeared in the doorway with his jacket over his arm and the particular quality of tiredness that a man like Seo Jin would never call tiredness, but that she could see in the set of his shoulders. She should have let it go. The photograph was private. The room was sealed for a reason. She had seen what she'd seen, and the professional thing, the sensible thing, the self-protective thing, was to complete her inventory note and move on. She had been doing the sensible, self-protective thing for 12 years. "The room at the end of the eastern corridor," she said. "I needed to include it in the inventory. I opened it." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry if I shouldn't have." He was still for a moment. "It's fine," he said. His voice was even. "There's a photograph on the wall," she said. And then, because she had decided to be honest, a decision she was making more frequently these days, as if honesty were a muscle she was slowly returning to use. She looks like you. The stillness that moved through him was different from his usual stillness. This one had weight in it, the weight of something that had been set down a long time ago in a closed room and had not been picked up since. My mother, he said. Zara nodded. When did she pass? A beat. 4 years ago, he said. Something moved in Zara's chest, the particular resonance of a timeline that matched her own loss. 4 years ago. Her father. His mother. The parallel was imprecise, but the grief beneath it was not. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it with the specific, textured meaning of someone who knows exactly the weight of the sentence they are speaking. He looked at her, and something in his eyes shifted, slightly, in the way of a man who has received understanding from an unexpected direction and doesn't entirely know what to do with it. She never forgave me, he said. The words arrived quietly, without preamble or decoration, as if they had been waiting behind a door and had chosen, without particular ceremony, this moment to walk through it. Zara did not fill the silence that followed. She had learned, was learning more every day, that some silences needed to be left whole. For what I became, he said. His eyes moved to the window. The life I chose. The organization. The last word carried a particular weight. She knew what it was. She never pretended otherwise. She wanted, he stopped. Something worked in his jaw. She wanted something different for me. And I chose this instead, and she spent the last 6 years of her life. Another stop. Longer. Loving me anyway, but not forgiving me. Those were different things for her. The room was very quiet. Zara thought about a hospital room. A hand held. A sentence spoken to a man who could no longer answer. I know you loved me, Daddy. Yes, she said softly. They are different things. He looked at her then, directly, with the full force of that unguarded attention that she was beginning to understand was his most honest self. And she looked back, and something passed between them that required no translation. Grief. The specific, complicated grief of loving people who failed you and being failed by people you loved, and the way both of those things can be true simultaneously without canceling each other out. Your scars, he said quietly. Not a question, not a recoil, just the subject offered gently, the way you might open a window in a room that has been closed too long. Zara was quiet for a moment. A kitchen fire, she said. 5 years ago. Accident. Yes. A pause. The accident was the fire. She looked at her hands. What happened before it? That was something else. He waited. She had not told this to anyone. Not the full version, not the scholarship, not Vivian, not the 12-year accumulation of being systematically made small by someone who had positioned herself between Zara and every door that might have led somewhere. She had carried it alone because carrying it alone was safer than handing it to someone who might use it, or worse, not understand its weight. She looked at this man, this closed, complicated, dangerous, surprisingly careful man, and made a decision. She talked. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. Enough that when she finished, the room felt different than it had at the start. As if something that had been held under pressure had been partially, carefully released. He listened without interrupting. Without the expressions people sometimes make when they're listening. The performed sympathy, the interjections that are really about making themselves feel present. He just listened, with the quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was his particular form of respect. When she finished, there was silence. Then he said, "The scholarship." "Yes. It still exists." "The program?" She blinked. I don't know. It's been 8 years." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes had moved to the middle distance. The particular look of a man filing information into a category she couldn't yet see. "Mr. Kwan," she began. "C.O. Jean," he said. She stopped. He looked at her. "You called me Mr. Kwan. We've been in a corridor, a garden, and now a study. I think C.O. Jean is," the not-quite smile, brief and devastating, "more accurate." Something happened in Zara's chest. Small. Warm. Terrifying. "C.O. Jean," she said. He nodded once, as if the word in her voice was something he was going to keep. "The sketchbook," he said. "On the windowsill in your apartment. Those are yours." She froze. "You've seen. The side garden. The window faces it." He was looking at her steadily. "I wasn't, I saw it once. From outside." She breathed. "Yes," she said. "They're mine. How long since you drew seriously?" The question landed with the gentleness and the precision of something that knew exactly where it was going. 8 years, she said. Quietly. The same number as the scholarship. They both heard that. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, not looking at her, looking at the window, speaking with the careful understatement of a man for whom directness was a discipline. "That's too long. For words." She looked at her hands. She did not trust her voice entirely. "Yes," she said when she was sure of it. "It is." They stayed in the study for another hour. Not talking the whole time. That was not what it was. He returned to his work. She finished with the contracts. But the room held something different now than it had before, the way a room holds the quality of a conversation, even after the conversation ends. The air had changed texture. Something that had been sealed was slightly, irrevocably open. She said good night at 10. He said good night without looking up from his desk. She was at the door when he said, "Zara." She turned. He was looking at her now, directly from across the room, with the particular quality of attention she had stopped trying to manage. "Thank you," he said, "for asking about her." She understood completely what the sentence cost him. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She walked down the corridor to the stairs and down the stairs and through the quiet house to the side entrance and her apartment. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, as she had done so many times before. But the dark felt different tonight. Not smaller, exactly. More inhabited. She reached for the sketchbook on the windowsill, opened it to a fresh page, and drew for the next 2 hours without stopping, the lines coming faster and more certain than they had in years, her hand moving with the confidence of something that had been away a long time and had finally found its way back. It started with tea. Not dramatically. Nothing between them happened dramatically, she was learning. Things happened the way tides happen. Gradually, irresistibly, the water moving so quietly you don't notice how far it's come until you look back at where the shore used to be. She had been working late, 3 weeks into her time at the townhouse. The dinner party successfully executed 2 days prior, the household running with the smooth efficiency of something that had found its correct rhythm. It was past 11. She was at the kitchen island with the household accounts spread in front of her, cross-referencing supplier invoices against the monthly budget with the focused intensity of someone who found genuine satisfaction in making numbers tell the truth. She heard him on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, dark shirt, no jacket, the careful containment of his usual presentation slightly loosened by the hour. He looked at her, then at the paperwork, then moved to the kettle without comment. She heard him fill it, set it to boil. The sound of cupboards opening. 2 cups instead of 1. She said nothing, kept her eyes on the invoices. He set the tea on the island beside her. To her left, slightly out of her direct eye line, so that accepting it required no acknowledgement, no performance of gratitude, no social transaction at all. Just the tea present available. She picked it up after a moment. Drank. Ginger and something else. Cardamom, she thought. Warm and specific, and not what she would have chosen for herself, but correct in a way she couldn't immediately explain. She looked up. He was on the other side of the island with his own cup, reading something on his phone with the selective attention of a man sorting signal from noise. "How did you know?" she said. He looked up. "The tea," she said. "You didn't ask." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression, that quality of almost amusement she had come to catalogue carefully, because it was rare and therefore, she had learned, significant. "You had ginger biscuits with your coffee on Tuesday," he said. "And again on Thursday." She stared at him. "You noticed that," she said. It was not quite a question. "I notice things," he said and returned to his phone. Zara looked at her tea. She was aware, with sudden and inconvenient clarity, that she was smiling. Not the small, tucked-away smile she deployed for social purposes. The one she kept brief and controlled and directed generally away from whoever had prompted it. This one was different. Whiter. Less supervised. She turned back to her invoices before he could see it. She was fairly certain he saw it anyway. The dinner party debriefs happened the following morning. A practical review of what had worked and what required adjustment for future events. She had prepared notes. He had characteristically already identified the same issues she had and was waiting to see if her assessment matched his. It did almost entirely. The sommelier was late to the third course, she said. 12 minutes, he confirmed. I'll find an alternative for next time. She made a note. The seating arrangement. Your instinct was right about separating the Choi and Park representatives. That worked. Your instinct, he said. You rearranged the cards the morning of. She looked up. You saw that. I see things, he said again, and this time the not-quite smile arrived fully enough that she could see it clearly, and it did something to her chest that she was becoming less able to categorize as professional. She looked at her notes. The flowers were wrong, she said. Yes. I told the supplier white orchids. They sent something else entirely. I've flagged it. It won't happen again. She turned a page. Overall, it was well done, he said. She stopped. In 3 weeks, he had been specific, precise, and exacting about every element of the household operation. He had noted what worked without embellishment and what didn't without cruelty, and he had never once, not once offered a general, open-handed assessment like the one he had just given. She looked at him. He was looking at his own copy of the notes with the same focused expression as always, and if the sentence had cost him anything, his face was not reporting it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Turned a page. She turned a page, and in the silence that followed, the particular silence of two people sitting with something that has just moved between them, she felt, tentatively and with considerable suspicion, the early architecture of something that might be called ease. The laughter happened on a Sunday. Sundays were quiet at the townhouse. No staff, no scheduled events, the house settling into itself in a different key than the work week. Zara usually used the time for planning, for the longer horizon organizational work that got crowded out during busy days. She was in the study, he had told her, in the 3rd week, that she could use it when he wasn't, working through the calendar for the following month when she heard him in the kitchen. Then she heard something else. A sound she had not heard from him before and did not, for a full 2 seconds, identify correctly. Swearing. In Korean. Under his breath, rapid and inventive, and clearly directed at something that had gone wrong in a domestic context. She set down her pen. She was not going to go and look. That was not. She was keeping appropriate distances. She was maintaining the professional framework that kept everything in its correct place. She went and looked. He was standing in front of the stove with an expression of contained affront and a pan that was producing an amount of smoke that suggested whatever had been in it had made a unilateral decision about its own fate. The kitchen smelled of burnt something. Eggs, she thought, or what had recently been eggs before they made other arrangements. He looked at her. She looked at the pan. Don't, he said. I haven't said anything, she said. You were going to. I was going to ask if you needed. I had it under control. She looked at the pan again. The smoke was still happening. She said. Something happened on his face. The expression of a man whose dignity has been lightly but accurately punctured and who is deciding what to do about it. And then she watched it arrive slowly like a sunrise, he laughed. Not the controlled, social kind. Not the brief, politely concluded sound that functions as a laugh without committing to one. A real one, short and surprised and entirely unguarded. The laugh of someone who has been caught and has decided, this once, that it's actually funny. She felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. She laughed too, her own real laugh, the one she kept mostly out of circulation, lower and warmer than people expected, the laugh her mother had called the honest one. They stood in the smoky kitchen and laughed together, briefly and genuinely. And it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary moment she had experienced in longer than she could accurately calculate. "Sit down," she said when the laughing had settled. "I'll make eggs." "You don't need to. Sit down, Jean." A beat. His name in her voice, direct and easy, without the careful professional framing she usually gave it. He sat down. She made eggs properly, the way her mother had taught her, with butter at exactly the right temperature and patience that most people didn't apply to eggs because they didn't understand that eggs rewarded patience. She added toast. Found the good salt on the third shelf where Mrs. Beck kept it. She set the plate in front of him. He looked at it for a moment, then at her, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before and couldn't immediately name. Something is open in it. Something that might, in different language, be called grateful, though on his face it wore different clothes. "Sit," he said. "I should get back to the Zara." Just her name. But the way he said it had a weight that the professional framework she'd been maintaining didn't entirely know what to do with. She sat. He made her a plate too, she hadn't noticed him doing it, and set it in front of her, and they ate at the kitchen island on a quiet Sunday morning with the light coming in through the windows and the city doing its distant, irrelevant thing beyond the walls. She ate. He ate. "Your mother," she said after a while. "Did she cook?" He was quiet for a moment. "Everything," he said. She believed. She used to say that cooking for someone was the most honest thing you could do for them, because it required you to pay attention to what they actually needed. Not what you assumed. What they needed. Zara turned this over. "She sounds like she was remarkable," she said. "She was the most stubborn person I have ever known," he said. "And the most," he stopped. Something worked in his jaw. "Yes. Remarkable." She looked at him. He looked at his plate. "She would have liked you," he said quietly, as if he hadn't entirely meant to say it aloud. The sentence landed somewhere very specific and very undefended in Zara's chest. She did not immediately respond. She let the words sit, let them be real, let them mean what they meant without rushing to minimize or redirect. "Tell me about her," she said. And he did. "What does it feel like when someone finally sees you? Not the version of you that the world made, but the real one underneath. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment like that?" He talked about his mother the way people talk about people they have not allowed themselves to talk about in a long time. Carefully at first, testing the weight of each memory before committing to it, and then with increasing ease as the kitchen held the conversation without judgment. Her name was Kwon Soo-yeon. She had been a schoolteacher in Seoul, mathematics, which Jean said with a kind of fond exasperation that told Zara everything about both of them. She had been small and precise, and had held opinions about everything from political policy to the correct way to fold laundry with equal conviction and zero apology. She never raised her voice, he said. She never needed to. She could make you feel the full weight of her disappointment with an expression. Just, he demonstrated briefly, a look of composed and total devastation, and Zara laughed. Like that. Every teacher in the school feared her. I feared her. You feared your mother, Zara said. I feared disappointing her, he said. The correction was quiet and precise. Those were different things. She looked at him. Yes, she said. They are. The echo of their earlier conversation moved between them. The same words, the same understanding. She watched him feel it too. He looked at his coffee. She looked at hers. She came to visit once, he said. Here. This house. She sat in the room at the end of the corridor and looked out the window for a long time and didn't say anything. And then she said, he stopped. A longer stop than usual. She said, I don't recognize you anymore, Gina. And I said something I can't take back. Something about the life I'd chosen being mine to choose. He was quiet. She left the next morning. We spoke on the phone after that. But she didn't come back to the house. Zara was very still. And the room, she said softly. He nodded once. I closed it when she died. She understood completely the grammar of that. The sealed room. The sheeted furniture. The one uncovered photograph, the only thing he couldn't bring himself to put away. "You keep her photograph uncovered," she said. He looked up. "I couldn't," he started. Stopped. "The rest of it, yes. But not that." She looked at him, this closed, difficult, careful man who had shut an entire room against his grief and left one photograph exposed like a wound he couldn't quite close, and felt something move through her with a force that was entirely incompatible with the professional framework she had been maintaining. She did not act on it, but she felt it completely, and she did not try to talk herself out of it this time. The almost touch happened later that afternoon. She was reaching past him in the study, a narrow corridor between the desk and the bookshelf, reaching for a folder on the shelf behind him, and he had shifted to give her room, and for one moment they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, near enough that if either of them had moved a fraction of an inch. Neither of them moved. She got the folder. He returned to what he'd been doing. But for the 3 seconds of that proximity, neither of them breathed, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything, and the not saying was the loudest thing in the room. That evening, after dinner, which she had cooked again, and he had eaten with the focused appreciation of someone who had been eating functional food for a long time and had forgotten what the alternative felt like. He found her in the sitting room on the ground floor. She had her sketchbook. She had been drawing with increasing regularity now, every evening, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2. The sketchbook was filling up faster than she'd expected, the designs coming with an urgency that felt like water finding a crack it had been waiting years to move through. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "May I?" he said, indicating the sketchbook. She hesitated, the old hesitation, the reflex of protecting what was hers because what was hers had so often been taken. Then she held it out. He took it, sat across from her, turned the pages slowly, not rapidly, not with the polite speed of someone performing interest, but slowly. Actually looking, his expression moving through something she watched with her whole attention. He turned a page. Stopped. She knew which page it was without looking. The woman she'd drawn the night she'd reopened the sketchbook. Shoulders back, head level, the dress that didn't apologize for the collarbone it revealed. The scars drawn in, present and unhidden. He looked at it for a long time. "This is you," he said. Not a question. She said nothing. He looked up. "These should exist in the world, Zara." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "All of them. But this one," he looked back at the page. "Especially this one." She had known, when she drew it, that it was something. She had known it in the specific way you know when you have made something true, when the making of it has required you to be more honest than is comfortable, and the result carries that honesty in every line. She had not expected someone else to see it. She had not known how much she needed someone to see it. She looked at the window, at the evening light going amber on the garden outside, at the tree nearest the glass, its branches moving in some small wind she couldn't feel from here. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, resting in her lap, were not. He closed the sketchbook carefully, set it on the cushion beside her, not handing it back with the finality of a returned object, but setting it down gently, close, like something that belonged in her orbit. He stood. "Good night, Zara," he said. "Good night, C.O. Jean." He walked to the door, paused, with his hand on the frame. "The dinner next Friday," he said, without turning around. "There will be a business associate. He collects contemporary design. Original pieces." A pause. "You might want to bring the sketchbook." Then he was gone. She sat in the sitting room in the amber evening light with her sketchbook beside her and felt, for the first time in 8 years, in the particular way she had stopped letting herself feel it, the precise, overwhelming, terrifying sensation of a future arriving. She pressed both hands flat against her knees, breathed, smiled, the real one, the honest one. Let it stay on her face as long as it wanted. It stayed for a long time. She arrived on a Tuesday. Zara should have anticipated it. In retrospect, the signs were there, arranged with the particular precision of a woman who had spent decades engineering outcomes from a distance. The missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. The text from a former neighbor, carefully casual, mentioning that Vivian had been asking questions. The silence from Vivian herself, which was never actual silence, but rather the held breath before something calculated. She should have anticipated it. She didn't. It was mid-morning when the townhouse intercom buzzed. Zara was in the study, coordinating the guest list for the Friday dinner. The sketchbook on the desk beside her, because she had started keeping it close in the way you keep close things that have been returned to you after a long absence. Mrs. Beck's voice came through the intercom, carefully neutral in the way of a woman who had worked for C.O. Jean long enough to understand that neutrality was a professional skill. "There is a woman at the gate, Miss Osei. She says she is your family." Zara's hand stilled on the pen. She looked at the intercom. She thought very briefly about saying no. "Let her in," she said, because she was not ultimately afraid of Vivian. She had been for a very long time, but something had shifted in the past weeks. Some essential recalibration of what she owed and to whom. And the woman who buzzed Vivian Marchetti through the gate of C.O. Jean Kwan's townhouse was not the same woman who had stood at that apartment door with a box in her arms, feeling the gravitational pull of a known cage. She was not that woman anymore. She was becoming, slowly and irreversibly, someone else. Vivian looked exactly the same. This was somehow the most unsettling thing. That she arrived at the townhouse in the Northern District, in her good coat, with her silver blonde hair and her carefully deployed pleasantness, looking precisely as she always had. As if nothing had changed. As if the last 4 weeks had not happened. She stepped into the front hallway and looked around with the assessing eye of a woman cataloging her surroundings for later use. "Well," she said, "he's done well for himself. What do you want, Vivian?" Zara said, "I came to see you." She turned and her eyes moved over Zara, the hair natural and out, the face bare of concealer, the posture which was different, straighter, less apologetic. Something moved across Vivian's expression. Not surprise exactly. Something more calculated than surprise. "You look different." "I'm working," Zara said. "If you have something to say, say it. I'd like to speak with your employer." Zara went still. "That's not." "As a courtesy," Vivian said pleasantly. "I feel it's only right, given our family connection, that I introduce myself. Make sure he has the full picture." The words landed with precision. The full picture. Zara heard exactly what was inside them. "Vivian, is he in?" C.O. Jean had returned from a morning meeting 20 minutes earlier. Zara had heard him on the stairs. She had not told Vivian this. But the townhouse was not large, and Vivian's voice carried with the practiced projection of a woman who had learned long ago that being overheard was sometimes the strategy. He appeared in the hallway doorway. He looked at Vivian, then at Zara. Something in his expression asked a question without asking it. "My stepmother," Zara said. The word was entirely flat. "Vivian Marchetti." She extended her hand with the gracious confidence of a woman arriving at a social occasion she had organized herself. "I hope I'm not interrupting." He shook her hand with the brief, non-committal courtesy of a man who had assessed the situation and was gathering more information before deciding what to do with it. "Mr. Kwan." Vivian smiled. "I've been hoping for the chance to speak with you." "About Zara." "I'll be in the study," Zara said to C.O. Jean, keeping her voice level. "Zara, darling, don't go." "You said you wanted to speak with him," Zara said. "Speak with him." She walked down the corridor to the study and closed the door and stood with her back against it in the quiet of the room and breathed. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. She could not hear the conversation. She told herself this was fine, that whatever Vivian said, C.O. Jean was not a man who accepted information without interrogation, and he was not a man easily manipulated, and 12 years of Vivian's particular craft could not be deployed effectively against someone who had spent his adult life reading people for survival. She told herself this. She organized the guest list. She reviewed the menu. She picked up her pen and set it down and picked it up again. 15 minutes passed. 20. She heard the front door. Then footsteps in the corridor. His footsteps, the even, deliberate pace she had learned to recognize. The study door opened. She knew from his face that it had not gone well. Not because he looked angry, he didn't, or not in any way that would register on a face less familiar to her than his had become. But there was something in his expression that she recognized as the closed-down quality he'd had in the very beginning. The weeks before the corridor, the weeks before the sealed room and the photograph and the Sunday morning eggs. The careful, armored containment of a man who has retreated behind a decision. He stood in the doorway. She stood at the desk. What did she say? Zara said. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the sketchbook on the desk. Briefly, a single glance, and then back to her face. She had photographs, he said. Zara frowned. Of what? You. Taken over several years. A pause. And documentation. Records of interactions. Incidents she characterized as, he stopped. Chose the next words with a precision that told her he was editing. Instability. She described a pattern of behavior. Accusations made against previous employers. She said there had been situations. The room was very quiet. Zara looked at him steadily. And you believe her. It was not a question. It was the most important thing she had ever said, and she needed the answer immediately, and his face was not giving it to her clearly. And that, the ambiguity of it, the fact that there was ambiguity at all, was what broke something open. I don't know what to believe, he said. And his voice was careful and even and measured. I don't know what to believe. She had waited 12 years for someone to look at her and simply believe her. Without evidence, without corroboration, without the exhausting bureaucratic process of proving your own credibility to people who had already decided the verdict. She had not asked him for that. She had never asked anyone for that, because she had learned that asking for belief was more dangerous than doing without it, because the refusal, when it came, cost more than the absence. And here it was, the refusal, in the measured voice of a careful man who didn't know what to believe. Something happened in her then. Not the old response. Not the practiced retreat into silence and compliance and the careful management of other people's comfort at the expense of her own. Not the swallowing of words. Not the smoothing over. Something else. Something that had been building for 4 weeks and 8 years and 12 years and 26 years, and had been fed by Gloria's warm hands on her face and a sketchbook on a windowsill, and a name said like it was information worth keeping. And these should exist in the world, and she would have liked you and cardamom tea placed exactly within reach without being asked. It rose. I want to tell you something, she said. Her voice was quiet, entirely steady, the steadiness of something that has decided. And I need you to hear it clearly. He looked at her. Vivian Marchetti forged my father's signature on documents that withdrew my scholarship application to the Royal Institute of Design when I was 18 years old. Each word landed separately, placed with care. She spent 12 years telling me my skin needed to be covered, that my scars were something to be hidden, that no man would choose me, that I was too dark, too damaged, too broken to deserve anything beyond what she decided to give me. She breathed. She is not a witness to my character. She is the reason I spent 8 years not drawing. She is the reason I stood in a kitchen at a party with my face painted over like something that needed correcting. She is the reason She stopped, because his expression had done something she wasn't prepared for. Not softening, not the performed sympathy she'd spent years learning to distrust. Something more conflicted than that. Something that might have been the look of a man in the middle of a realization. But she was too far into what she was saying and too raw to correctly read it, and what she saw in the ambiguity was confirmation of what she'd feared. He still wasn't sure. I've been here 4 weeks, she said. Quieter now. And in 4 weeks I have given this household everything I have. I have, she stopped again. I looked at the sketchbook, the one he'd held with both hands, the one he'd turned the pages of slowly, actually looking. This is you, he had said. These should exist in the world. I thought you saw me, she said. The sentence was very small. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to another person. The room held it. He opened his mouth. Zara, don't. She picked up the sketchbook from the desk. Her hands were steady, still. She was grateful for that, at least. I'm not angry with you. I understand that you don't know me the way you know Vivian's documentation. I understand that doubt is reasonable. She held his gaze. But I have spent my entire life being reasonable about other people's doubt. I don't have anything left for it today. She walked to the door. He didn't stop her. She walked out of the study and down the corridor and through the side entrance and into her apartment, and she closed the door behind her. She did not cry immediately. She sat on the edge of the bed, the same position, the same dark room, and held the sketchbook in her lap and looked at the window and felt the particular quality of this specific pain, which was different from the pain she was accustomed to. The pain she was accustomed to was the pain of being unseen, of moving through a world that looked through you, of being erased so gradually and so consistently that the erasure started to feel like your natural state. This pain was different. This was the pain of having been seen, actually genuinely specifically seen, and then watching the sight fail. This was the pain of having let someone in. It was worse. She had known it would be worse. She had known, on the subway to the Meridian Tower that first evening, and in the corridor after Bryce Hargrove's cruelty, and in the garden with the coffee, and in the study where she had told him about Vivian and felt the weight of 12 years leave her body. She had known that letting someone in created a specific and irreplaceable vulnerability. She had let him in anyway, and here was the cost. She opened the sketchbook, turned to the drawing of the woman with her shoulders back, the scars visible, the dress that didn't apologize for the collarbone it revealed. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to a fresh page. She didn't draw. She just sat with the blank page and the quiet and the specific weight of a pain she had earned by choosing, for the first time in years, to hope. Outside, through the window, the garden was still. The trees were unmoving in the evening air. The city beyond the walls continued its enormous, indifferent project. And somewhere in the house above her, she knew, she could feel it in the particular quality of the silence, that Co. Jean Quan was standing in a room with a decision he had not yet made. She did not go back upstairs to help him make it. Some decisions, she had learned, could only be made alone. She had made hers. Now it was his turn. Dae-young found him in the study. He hadn't been summoned. He rarely was, because the summoning was usually unnecessary. He had been outside the townhouse when the silver-haired woman arrived, and he had watched her leave 40 minutes later with the expression of a man cataloging a variable. And then he had made 2 phone calls and sat with what he found, and then come inside. Co. Jean was at the window. This was how Dae knew, with the certainty of 12 years' close observation, that something significant had occurred. Not meetings, not threats, not the pressures of the organization ever sent him to the window. Only the things that moved in the register that the organization could not reach. She's in her apartment, Dae said. Co. Jean said nothing. The stepmother's documentation, Dae said, setting a folder on the desk. I had it pulled while she was here. Co. Jean turned. Dae kept his expression neutral. The photographs were real. The timeline was manufactured. There are no records of accusations against previous employers. I checked 3 databases. A pause. The scholarship withdrawal, he indicated a page in the folder. The signature on the withdrawal form is Emmanuel Osei's. But the withdrawal was filed from an IP address registered to a shell company. One of 3 that Vivian Marchetti has operated under various names for the past 14 years. He paused. One of those companies has financial entanglements with a holding group that we've been watching for separate reasons. Co. Jean looked at him. She manufactured it, he said. Not a question. The voice of a man arriving at a conclusion and feeling the full weight of what that conclusion meant. Not just as information, but as indictment. Of Vivian. And of himself. All of it, Dae said. The study was very quiet. Dae picked up the folder. Set it down again. He had one more thing to say, and he was deciding how to say it, which was unusual for him. He was not, typically, a man who deliberated over delivery. She looked at you, he said finally, when she came to this house the first time, and the second, and every day since. He was looking at the wall, not at Co. Jean, giving him the privacy of not being watched while he heard this. Not the way people look at you. Not the way, he stopped. Recalibrated. The way your mother used to look at you. Before. The silence that followed was the longest one Day had ever maintained in this man's presence. Co. Jean turned back to the window. Outside, the garden was still. The apartment light was on, the one in the ground floor window, the one he could see from here if he positioned himself exactly right, which he was not doing, which he was absolutely not doing. Go home, Day, he said. Day went to the door. Co. Jean. First name. Day used it approximately 4 times a year, at moments of precise necessity. Co. Jean turned. Day looked at him, directly, with the full, unvarnished honesty of a man who had known him longer than anyone alive. Don't be an idiot, he said. Then he left. He read the file 3 times. Not because the information was unclear. Day's documentation was never unclear, assembled with the same precise, exhaustive thoroughness that made him the most valuable person in Co. Jin's organization, and possibly in his life. Though that was not a sentence Co. Jean had ever said aloud and did not intend to. The file was clear. The evidence was unambiguous. The manufactured timeline, the forged IP trail, the shell companies, the withdrawal form filed from an address that had never belonged to Emmanuel Osei. It was all there, laid out with the cold specificity of fact. He read it 3 times because the first time, he was reading the information. The second time, he was reading what the information meant about Vivian Marchetti. The third time, he was reading what it meant about himself. He had been in the study for 2 hours. The folder was on the desk in front of him, open to the page Day had indicated. The IP address, the shell company registration, the dates that aligned with devastating precision to the timeline Zara had described in this same room, in this same chair, 3 weeks ago. He had listened to her then. He had heard her. He had believed her in the way he believed most things, provisionally, subject to verification, held at the careful distance of a man for whom trust was a calculated extension rather than a default state. He had thought that was enough. He understood now that it was not. The problem, and he was sitting with the full, unvarnished shape of it now, the way he rarely sat with anything that implicated him personally, was not that he had doubted. Doubt was not the failure. The failure was the expression on his face when he said, I don't know what to believe, the specific quality of it, the carefulness of it, that had told her. A woman who had spent 26 years learning to read the precise texture of other people's doubt, that he was weighing her against documentation, that he was making her prove herself. To him, after everything she had told him, after the sealed room and his mother's photograph, and she loved me anyway, but not forgiving me, and that's too long and cardamom tea, and a sketchbook held in both hands. After all of that, the first time someone arrived with an organized case against her, he had stood in the doorway of the study with the careful, measured expression of a man withholding judgment. And she had said, I thought you saw me. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Breathed. Outside the study window, the garden was dark now. The evening fully arrived, the city lights beginning their familiar negotiation with the sky. The apartment window was lit. He was not looking at it. He was thinking about his mother. Not the grief of her. Not the closed room and the sheeted furniture and the photograph he couldn't put away. He was thinking about something specific she had said to him, years before the end, during one of the phone calls that had replaced the visits she'd stopped making. Gina, she had said, with the particular combination of exasperation and love that was her most characteristic mode, you are very good at being right. You are very bad at being wrong quickly enough to matter. He had disagreed with her at the time. He had explained, patiently, that careful assessment was not the same as slowness, that the value of his particular way of processing the world was precisely its accuracy. His mother had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, Accuracy is not the point, my son. The point is what you do with it, and when. He had not understood what she meant. He understood now. He stood, walked to the window. The apartment light was on, warm and steady in the dark garden, a rectangle of gold against the old stone of the ground floor. He had not been looking at it. He looked at it now directly and allowed himself to fully register what was in him. Fear. He identified it with the same clinical precision he brought to everything. And then, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he did not immediately set about managing it. He just let it exist. Named it the way you name a thing to reduce its power over you, or sometimes he was discovering to understand it more clearly than the power reduction framing allowed. He was afraid. Not of Vivian, not of her documentation, not of the organizational implications of any of this. Those were problems with solutions, and solutions were his native language. He was afraid of the thing that had been growing in this house for 4 weeks, the thing that had started in a service corridor with "you don't have to say yes," and had continued through a garden and a kitchen, and a Sunday morning, and a study and a sketchbook held in both hands. He was afraid of it because it was the one category of thing he had never learned to manage, and the one category of thing that, unmanaged, could reach somewhere the organization and the armor and the floor-to-ceiling. Windows and the 47 floors of deliberate, architectural power could not protect. His mother had tried to tell him this too. He had not listened then either. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. He needed to be clear with himself about this. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not a man who arrived at doors with declarations, who deployed the language of feeling with the fluency of people for whom that language was a first tongue. He had spent 20 years building a life specifically structured around the fact that he was not that person, and the structure had served him, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. But Day had said don't be an idiot, and his mother had said the point is what you do with it. And the apartment light was on, and she was in there with a blank page she wasn't drawing on, and the sketchbook she had carried out of this study like something she needed to protect from him. He put the phone in his pocket, walked to the door. He stopped at her apartment door for longer than he would admit. Not from uncertainty about whether to knock. That decision had been made upstairs, and Co. Jean Quan did not make decisions and then stand outside them reconsidering. He stopped because he was doing something he almost never did. He was preparing to speak without knowing in advance exactly what he was going to say. This was, for him, the equivalent of stepping onto unmapped ground without instruments. He knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened. She had changed out of her work clothes. She was in something simpler now, a loose shirt, her hair fully out and unconstrained, the natural coils of it framing her face in the warm light of the apartment. No concealer, there never was anymore. Just her face, her actual face, with the tiredness of the day in it and the residue of the afternoon's conversation, and, underneath both of those things, the quality of composure that he had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the management of it. The same thing he did, he realized, differently packaged. She looked at him. She did not say anything. Neither did he for a moment. And in that moment, in the particular quality of her waiting, he understood something. She was not going to make this easy. Not from cruelty. There was no cruelty in her. He had catalogued her thoroughly enough to be certain of that, but because she had made things easy for people her entire life, had managed their discomfort and smoothed their uncertainty and absorbed their doubt, and she had decided, somewhere in the hours since she walked out of the study, that she was done doing that. She was going to let him do the work. He deserved that. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "Not for doubting," he said. Doubt is part of how I function. I don't know how to remove it from the process." He held her gaze. "But the way I expressed it, standing in the doorway while she was still in this house, with her documentation on the table, and telling you I didn't know what to believe." He stopped. That was wrong. That was the wrong thing to give you in that moment. And I knew it while I was doing it, and I did it anyway because careful was easier than certain, and that is something I need to own." She looked at him. "Go on," she said. Quietly, he reached into his jacket, took out the folder, or the relevant pages of it, the ones Day had flagged. He held them out. She took them slowly. She looked at the first page. He watched her face as she read. The precise, focused movement of her eyes across the text, the stillness of her expression, and then the shift in it. Subtle, The particular quality of a person encountering the confirmation of something they already knew to be true and feeling the complex, specific weight of being validated after years of being denied it. She turned to the second page. Read it. Her jaw worked once. The Shell Company, she said. Registered 14 years ago, he said. 3 months after your father married her. She looked at the page. She planned it, Zara said. Not a question. Not outrage. Just the quiet, devastating recognition of a woman understanding, finally and completely, the true shape of what had been done to her. From the beginning, he said. Or close to it. She set the pages down on the small table by the door. Looked at them for a moment. Then looked at him. What do you want me to do with this? She said. Whatever you choose, he said. There are legal options. The forgery is documentable. The financial manipulation. I know what the options are, she said. That's not what I'm asking. He was quiet. I'm asking what you want, she said. From telling me this. From coming here tonight. She held his gaze with the direct, unflinching quality that had first stopped him in a service corridor 4 weeks ago. What do you want, Jean? The question sat in the air between them. He had prepared, to the limited extent that he had prepared anything tonight. For the apology, for the evidence, for the practical conversation about what came next. He had not prepared for this, because this required something he had not practiced. The direct, unguarded, first-person articulation of what he actually wanted. Not what was strategic. Not what was reasonable. What he wanted. He looked at her, in the doorway of the small apartment, in the warm light, with her real face and her real hair and her steady eyes. And he did something he had not done with another person in more years than he could accurately calculate. He told the truth. I want, he started. Stopped. The words were there, but the architecture for delivering them was not, and he was going to have to build it in real time, which was not how he did things, which was exactly the problem his mother had been trying to diagnose for years. He tried again. When you walked out of the study, he said, I stood at the window, and I told myself I was thinking through the implications, the documentation, the organizational angle with Vivian's shell companies. He paused. And then I stopped lying to myself, which I don't do often enough, and I admitted that I was standing at the window because I could see the light in your apartment from there. She was very still. I have been, he stopped. I have structured my life very deliberately around not needing people. Not in the way that sounds in the telling, not with self-awareness about the tragedy of it, not with, I genuinely believed it was correct. That need was a liability and connection was a vulnerability, and the life I had built was better for the absence of those things. He looked at her steadily. And then I stood in a corridor at the Meridian Tower and said, you don't have to say yes, and drove home telling myself it was a social correction that had nothing to do with a specific person. Something moved in her expression. And then I pulled your file, he said, which I also told myself was a habit. Was it? She said. No, he said. It was not. The apartment was very quiet. The garden behind her window was dark and still, the city lights a distant haze beyond the walls. You asked me what I want, he said. I want. And here his voice did something it almost never did, the slightest shift in register, the faintest evidence of something unmanaged. I want to know if what has happened in this house over the past 4 weeks has been. I want to know if it is real. For you. Not as an employee, not as someone who is grateful for the position or the apartment or the evidence I just handed you. He stopped. She took a breath. You know it's real, she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. I know what I observe, he said. I don't always know what it means. Yes, you do, she said. You're just afraid of what it means. The sentence was not cruel. It was not a challenge. It was the simple, direct accuracy of a woman who had spent 4 weeks learning to read him, and was now reading him completely, and was not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I am. The admission arrived without drama, no lowered eyes, no performance of vulnerability. Just the word, true and unguarded, sitting between them in the doorway like something that had needed to be set down for a long time. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not the small, tucked-away smile, not the carefully managed version, but something larger and quieter and more serious than either. "I have spent," she started, and her voice was steady, though something underneath it was working very hard. "I have spent my entire life being told that I was not enough. Not light enough. Not smooth enough. Not undamaged enough to be chosen." She held his gaze. "And I decided, somewhere in the last 4 weeks, I think it started in the garden with the coffee, that I was done letting that be the story. Not because of you. It was already starting before." She stopped. "But you." She looked at her hands. The hands that were always steady until they weren't. "The sketchbook," she said. "The way you turned the pages. The way you said," she stopped. Breathed. "These should exist in the world." You said it like it was obvious. Like there was no other possible conclusion. She looked up. "No one has ever said anything like that to me." "It is obvious," he said. "It is not obvious to me yet," she said. "I'm working on it." Something happened on his face then. Something she had not seen before, not even on the Sunday morning with the eggs, not even in the study with his mother's stories. Something that was not the outline of a smile, but the real thing, complete and unguarded, arriving with the quality of something that had been released rather than produced. It changed his face entirely. She looked at it and felt, in her chest, the specific and overwhelming sensation of a wall coming down. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of something that has been standing under unsustainable pressure and has finally, with a kind of exhausted relief, decided to let go. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The business associate at Friday's dinner," he said. "Jung Min-suk. He does collect contemporary design. That part is true." A pause. "I also had my team reach out to 3 contacts at the Royal Institute of Design in London this week. There is a returning student program for exceptional candidates who were interrupted." He held her gaze. "The program director would like to see a portfolio." The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Zara stared at him. "You did that," she said. "I made inquiries," he said. "Before tonight," she said. "Before the file and the apology and—" "Yes," he said. "Why?" The word came out very quietly. He looked at her with the full, direct quality of a man who has decided finally and irrevocably to stop being careful. "Because these should exist in the world," he said. "And so should you. All of you, Zara. The way you actually are." She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. Not dramatically, just needing to feel something solid there, beneath the thing that was happening in her chest. She breathed. "Once. Twice. You should come in," she said. He looked at her. "The apartment," she said. "You should come in. And I'll make tea. And you can tell me everything you know about the returning student program." She held the door open wider. The warm light spilled out into the dark garden. "And then we can talk about what happens next." He looked at the open door. At her. At the open door. He stepped across the threshold. She closed the door behind them. Outside, the garden was dark and still, the city lights holding their distant conversation with the sky. The townhouse was quiet, Mrs. Beck gone home, Tobias gone home. The whole enormous house settled into the particular silence of an evening that has decided what it is. In the ground floor apartment, the light was on. It stayed on for a long time. Friday arrived the way important days sometimes do. Quietly, without fanfare, the morning looking like any other morning until you remembered what it was carrying. Zara was up before the sun again. The habit remained, but its meaning had continued its slow, steady transformation. The pre-dawn quiet no longer the only space that belonged to her, but now simply the space she preferred for the particular quality of thinking it aloud. She sat at the windowsill in her apartment with her sketchbook open and her tea cooling beside her, and watched the sky do its gradual, unhurried work of becoming morning. She had been drawing for 3 days with an urgency that felt like catching up. 8 years compressed into 72 hours of pencil and ink and the specific, physical joy of a hand doing what it was built to do. The sketchbook was nearly full. She had started a second one, a larger one, bought from the art supply shop 2 streets over on Wednesday morning, when she had walked there alone in the early light and stood in the aisle and chosen it with the careful attention of someone selecting something that mattered. She had paid for it herself. This was important to her. She turned to the page she'd been working on last night, the centerpiece of the portfolio she was assembling. A collection. 7 pieces, cohesive, built around a theme she had not consciously named until she was 3 pieces in and looked at what she'd made and understood what her hands had been saying without her permission. Women who were told to be less and refused. Each figure was different builds, different ages, different contexts. But each one wore something that had been designed specifically for her, that fit the body she actually had rather than the body someone else had decided she should want. Each one stood with the particular quality of ease that comes not from confidence as the world usually defines it, loud, performed, requiring an audience, but from the deeper thing underneath it, the ease of a person who has stopped apologizing for the space they occupy. The 7th figure, the last one, the one she'd finished at midnight, was the clearest. She was tall, dark-skinned, deep and rich and unapologetic. The scars along her left shoulder were visible above the neckline of the dress, a floor-length thing in a color that was halfway between amber and gold, the kind of color that needed a dark canvas to fully exist, that would have been diminished on anything lighter. She was not looking at the camera, if there were a camera. She was looking at something just beyond the frame, forward, and with the specific quality of someone who has decided where they are going and is already, in some essential sense, there. Zara looked at her for a long moment. Then she closed the sketchbook, got up, started getting ready for the day. She did not apply concealer. She had not applied it since the night Gloria pressed a kitchen cloth to her face in the catering kitchen of the Meridian Tower and said, "There she is." 27 days ago. She had counted. Her hair was out, fully, completely, the natural coils of it shaped and defined with the care she had recently started returning to them. She wore the dress she had bought on Thursday, deep burgundy, long-sleeved but fitted, with a neckline that sat just below the collarbone, just above the beginning of the scars. Visible if you looked, present if you paid attention. She looked at herself in the mirror, the small one, the one that only showed her face. Then she picked it up, walked to the other wall, and rehung it at full-body height. She stood in front of it, looked at the whole of herself. The dress, the hair, the face, the collarbone where the scars began, the posture that had been straightening incrementally for 4 weeks, as if her spine were slowly remembering something. She looked for a long time. There she is, she thought. She picked up the sketchbook and went to work. The dinner was at 8. By 7:15, the townhouse was ready. The table set with the precision she had brought to every event, the lighting adjusted to the warm, specific temperature that made a room feel like an invitation rather than a performance. The staff had done their work and gone. The kitchen was orderly. The wine had been opened to breathe. She was doing a final check of the dining room when she heard him on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, dark suit, the same contained quality of presence she had registered across a crowded room 5 weeks ago, though it read differently now. Not less powerful. Different in the way that a room reads differently when you know its interior. The same walls, other meanings. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them had discussed Wednesday evening specifically. What had been said in the doorway, the tea they'd made, the 2 hours they'd spent at her small kitchen table with her sketchbook open between them, and his voice describing the returning student program in the precise detail of a man who had researched it thoroughly. At some point the conversation had moved away from the institute and toward other things. Her mother, his childhood and soul, the mathematics teacher who had terrified an entire school, the fashion sketches Zara had made at 9 years old of women who looked like her aunties. They had not discussed it because what had happened in that apartment did not require discussion. It had simply happened, settled into the fabric of what they were to each other with the quiet permanence of something that had been true for a while and had finally been acknowledged. He crossed the dining room, stopped beside her. "The table," he said, looking at the setting. "I know," she said. The centerpiece is too tall. I'm fixing it. I wasn't going to say that, he said. She looked up. It's right, he said. Quietly. He was looking at the room with an expression that was not professional assessment. She could read the difference now. All of it. She looked at him for a moment. Go and be ready for your guests, she said. I have 8 minutes and I know what I'm doing. Something arrived on his face. The real smile, the complete and unguarded one she had seen for the first time in her apartment doorway, and which still, she was discovering, did the same thing to her chest regardless of how many times it appeared. Yes, he said. You do. He went to greet his guests. She fixed the centerpiece, lowering it 2 inches, which was correct, and stood back and looked at the room she had made and allowed herself, briefly and without apology, to feel the satisfaction of it. Jung Min-suk arrived at 8:15. He was Korean, mid-50s, with the particular energy of a man who paid attention to everything and found most of it interesting. The quality of a collector, she thought, someone whose relationship with beauty was active rather than passive. He had arrived with 2 associates and the easy authority of someone accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around him. He had also, she noticed, looked at the table arrangement for a full 6 seconds upon entering. Not critically, appreciatively. The eye of someone who understood that a well-organized space was its own kind of design. She moved through the dinner with the efficiency that was her professional signature. Present, attentive, managing the logistics of the evening with the invisible competence she had spent years honing. The courses arrived correctly. The wine was poured at the right moments. The 90-minute conversation window she had built between the 3rd course and dessert opened up exactly as she'd predicted. The guests settling into the particular ease of people who have eaten well and have nowhere to be. She was in the kitchen, coordinating the dessert timing, when Co. Jean appeared in the doorway. He wants to meet you, he said. She looked up. Who? Jung, he said. He asked who designed the table. I told him you managed the household. He said, a pause. He said the arrangement had a specific intelligence to it, that it understood how the room wanted to be used. She looked at him. He asked if you had other work, Co. Jean said. His voice was even, but she could read what was underneath it. The quality of a man trying very hard not to telegraph how much the answer mattered to him. She untied her apron, picked up the sketchbook from the counter where she'd placed it that morning. Present, visible, not hidden. Yes, she said. I do. She sat across from Jung Min-suk at the cleared end of the table while the other guests continued their conversations, with the sketchbook between them and the warm light of the dinner gathering falling over the pages as he turned them. He turned them the same way Co. Jean had, slowly. Actually looking. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face exactly as it was, and she did not perform anything. Not confidence, not deference, not the practiced pleasantness of someone seeking approval. She had spent a lifetime performing things for audiences who had already decided what they thought of her, and she was done with it. She was here. The work was here. It could speak or it couldn't. She watched him turn a page. Stop. She knew which page. The 7th figure. The amber gold dress. The scars above the neckline. The forward gaze. He looked at it for a long time. This is a self-portrait, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. You drew yourself as you intend to be, he said. Not as you are. Or, he looked more closely, not as you were. When you drew this. She considered that. Both, she said. I think it's both. He looked at her, directly, with the assessing intelligence of a collector who understood that the person and the work are never entirely separate. I have a gallery, he said. In Seoul. Contemporary design, wearable art, the intersection of fashion, and the kind of work that knows what it's saying. He closed the sketchbook gently, with the care she had learned to read as respect. I would like to show this collection, with your other work, when you've developed the full range. He paused. I understand you may be pursuing a formal program. The Institute. She glanced, briefly and involuntarily, at Co. Jean, who was 3 seats down in conversation with another guest, not looking at her, absolutely looking at her. I'm in conversation with them, she said. Good, Jung said. The gallery showing would complement the program, not compete with it. We would work around your timeline. He held her gaze. Miss Osei, this work is extraordinary. Not because of its technical skill, though that is evident. Because it knows what it believes. Work that knows what it believes is very rare. She sat with that. In the warm light of the dining room she had set, in the house she had made run smoothly, in the dress that didn't apologize for the collarbone it revealed, with the sketchbook she had carried out of a drawer and put on a windowsill, and then a counter, and then a table in a gallery director's hands. She sat with it. Thank you, she said. She meant it with the full, specific, textured weight of those two words. Everything they had cost to arrive at. The guests left at 11. She was clearing the last of the table when Co. Jean came back into the dining room. He didn't speak immediately. He moved to the other side of the table and began stacking plates with the focused practicality of a man who understood that helping was sometimes the most honest language available. She watched him stack plates for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. She smiled. They cleared the table together in a silence that was the most comfortable silence she had ever shared with another person. The kind that doesn't need to be filled because it is already full. When the table was clear, he went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups. Ginger and cardamom. He set hers to the left, slightly out of her direct eye line. She picked it up. They sat at the cleared table, not across from each other, but adjacent, at the corner, the way people sit when they are not performing a conversation but simply existing in the same space. Jung wants to show the collection, she said. I know, he said. He told me. She looked at her tea. The institute responded today, she said. The program director. She wants a video call next week. She paused. She said my application materials were. She stopped. She said they were extraordinary. Her word. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. Just that. As if there were no other possible response. As if extraordinary was simply the accurate word, and he had always known it, and was only mildly surprised it had taken everyone else this long to catch up. She looked at him. He looked at her. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask, he said. She turned her cup in her hands. The night you came to my door. The apology. The file. She paused. The portfolio inquiry you made before any of that. Yes, he said. Why, she said. Not the logical answer. Not the organizational angle or the evidence or the reasonable explanation. The real answer. He was quiet for a moment. In the quiet, she could hear the house, its particular settling sounds, the distant city, the radiator in the far room that had been threatening to fail since she arrived and kept refusing to. She had come to find it comforting, this house's specific brand of persistence. In the corridor, he said finally. At the Meridian Tower. You asked me why I stepped in. You said you knew, she said. I meant, he stopped. Looked at his hands. I meant that I knew what it was. What Hargrove was doing. The particular, the way certain people use public spaces to diminish other people. Because the public nature of it is part of the weapon. He paused. I grew up understanding that. Being the person in the room who didn't belong in the room, in the way they defined belonging. Before I was, he gestured briefly at the house, the suit, the implication of everything that came with it. Before all of this, I understood exactly what it felt like to be the object of that kind of diminishment. She looked at him. So yes, he said. I knew. Not just in the general sense. I knew what it cost you to stand there. And I could not, his jaw worked slightly. I could not watch it happen and do nothing. It was not a calculation. It was not a strategy. He looked at her directly. It was the first honest thing I had done in a room full of people in a very long time. The dining room held the sentence. She looked at this man, this difficult, careful, armored, surprisingly honest man who had grown up in rooms that didn't want him and had built an empire from the outside of belonging and still, in a service corridor at a party, had been unable to watch a woman be diminished without doing something about it. She reached across the corner of the table, put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his over and held it. Not tightly, not with the urgency of someone desperate, but with the deliberate, careful quality of someone who understood the value of what they were holding and intended to hold it correctly. They sat like that for a while. The city beyond the windows did its distant, irrelevant thing. The house settled around them. The radiator threatened to fail, and kept refusing to. This is the part of the story I want you to sit with, because it's not really about Zara and Jean. It's about every person who was told they were too much or too little or too dark or too damaged to be worthy of love. Was there ever a moment when someone saw the real you, and chose you anyway? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Later, much later, when the tea had cooled and the city had gone quiet in the particular way of the small hours, she picked up the sketchbook from the table, opened it to the seventh figure. The woman in the amber gold dress. The scars above the neckline. The forward gaze. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil. And in the lower corner of the page, small, precise, the way you sign something you have decided to claim, she wrote her name. Zara Osei. Not a signature of completion. A signature of beginning. She closed the sketchbook. Set it on the table between them. Not in her lap, not in a drawer, not tucked away somewhere it would need to be found. On the table. Visible. Present. Hers. Jean looked at the sketchbook. Then at her. She met his gaze, directly, fully, with the quality of looking that she had spent 26 years learning to withhold, because the withholding had felt like protection. She looked at him the way she had spent years not looking at people. Without the inventory of reasons not to, without the managed distance, without the careful governance of what she allowed her eyes to say. She looked at him the way the woman in the amber dress looked at something just beyond the frame. Forward. Already, in some essential sense, there. He looked back. And in a room full of cleared dinner plates and cooling tea and the quiet evidence of an evening that had been, in every sense she cared about, well done, she felt it arrive. Not loud, not announced, not the way she had imagined it, in the years when she had still allowed herself to imagine it, the dramatic arrival of a thing she'd stopped believing in. It arrived the way tides arrive, the way cardamom tea arrived, placed just within reach without being asked. The way a name arrives when said by someone who intends to keep it. Quietly, irresistibly, completely. She was loved. She knew it the way you know real things. Not because someone said it, though he would later say it with the same careful precision he brought to everything that mattered. She knew it the way you know a room you have been trying to find for a very long time. By the sensation, unmistakable and final, of arriving. She was loved. And she, Zara Osei, the woman they had tried to erase, the woman who had painted over her own face and folded her future into a drawer and learned to be small in a world that kept confirming smallness. She looked at the man across the corner of the table, with her name signed in the corner of her best work, and her real face in the light, and her scars above the neckline of a dress that didn't apologize for anything. She chose him back. She believed she would never be worthy of love. Then she stopped believing the lie. And the rest was just arriving. The gallery in Seoul was smaller than she'd expected. This was not a criticism. She had come to understand, in the months of preparation, that Jung Min-suk's galleries were intentionally intimate. He believed, he had told her over a video call in February, that art required proximity, that the distance of a large white room allowed people to observe without being changed, and being changed was the point. She stood at the entrance of the gallery on the opening night and looked at what she had made. 7 pieces, the original collection, fully realized now, translated from sketchbook to physical garment by the hands of 3 seamstresses she had worked with in the months since the dinner. The months since the institute had accepted her into the returning student program with a scholarship that the program director described as, again, extraordinary, and which Zara had accepted with the specific and overwhelming sensation of a future arriving for the second time. The first time in her body, the second time real. The 7th piece was at the end of the gallery. The amber gold dress, constructed in fabric that moved the way she had imagined it when the pencil first touched the page. Flowing, warm, unapologetic. Worn by a model she had selected specifically, dark-skinned, with the deep and luminous quality of skin that had been told its darkness was a liability and had simply declined to accept that. The scars were visible, not the models, but represented in the design itself, in the deliberate asymmetry of the neckline, in the careful, specific way the fabric fell across the left shoulder. Present, unhidden, part of the composition. She stood at the entrance and looked at it. The gallery filled. The guests were the particular mixture of Seoul's design and art world. Collectors, critics, students, the professionally curious. They moved through the space with the quality of attention that galleries require, stopping, looking, leaning in. They stopped longest at the seventh piece. She watched them stop. She was standing near the entrance, in a dress that was not one of hers. Not yet, not formally, though she was beginning to think about what her own wardrobe wanted to become. She had her hair out, fully and without negotiation. No concealer. The scars above her neckline visible in the gallery light. Seo Jin was beside her. He had come to Seoul with her, not announced, not performed. He had simply appeared at the airport with his carry-on and the expression of a man who had somewhere to be. And she had looked at him and looked at her boarding pass and not said anything, because some things had moved beyond the need for words. He was not holding her hand. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and occasionally, when someone stopped at the seventh piece for a long time, his hand would find the small of her back. Briefly, lightly, the way you steady something you trust to be steady, but want to touch anyway. She did not lean into it. She stood on her own. But she felt it every time. A young woman stopped in front of the seventh piece for longer than anyone else. She was perhaps 20, dark-skinned, with the quality of someone who had not yet fully decided what to do with herself, the particular unresolved energy of a person still negotiating the distance between who they've been told to be and who they actually are. She looked at the dress. She looked at the scars rendered in the asymmetric neckline. She looked for a long time. Then she turned and found Zara with her eyes, across the gallery, through the crowd, with the directness of someone who needed to look at the person who had made a thing and confirm that the person was real. Zara looked back. The young woman nodded, once small, the nod of someone receiving something they needed. Zara nodded back. The young woman turned back to the seventh piece. Zara looked at the floor for a moment, breathed. Seo Jin's hand, very briefly, at the small of her back. "You all right?" he said quietly. She looked up, at the gallery she had filled, at the dress at the end of the room, at the young woman still standing in front of it, at the city through the gallery windows, Seoul, bright and enormous and entirely unaware of what had just happened in this small, intimate space. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was becoming incrementally and irreversibly someone who said true things, more than all right. He looked at her. She looked at him. The real smile, the honest one, the one her mother had named, arrived on her face and stayed there, unhurried, entirely unsupervised. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the sketchbook, like something that should exist in the world, like something he intended to keep looking at for a very long time. She spent 26 years believing the lie. It took one corridor, one cup of tea, one man who refused to look away, and her own stubborn, beautiful decision to stop disappearing. The rest was just love, doing what love does when you finally let it.